Okay. There's someone else coming in. There we go. Okay, great, terrific. Welcome. Welcome to this very special webinar. My name is Dr. Stephen Sussman. I'm an associate professor of public administration and associate dean in the Andreas School of Business at Barry University in Miami, Florida, and co-founder of the Palm Beach Center for Democracy and Policy Research. Dr. Fleischman, Dr. Luis Fleischman, and I, along with a team of dedicated colleagues, established the center as an outlet for the marketplace of ideas. The Palm Beach Center for Democracy and Policy Research is a nonpartisan public policy organization, a research center, and a think tank. We are a gathering of scholars, experts, and community stakeholders engaged in research and dialogue in an effort to create practical policy recommendations to current local, national, and international challenges. Therefore, the center encourages discussion and research from multiple perspectives. We believe that good policy is the result of reasonable dialogue and healthy debate. We believe in the marketplace of ideas. Thus, through publishing balanced articles and community engagement, the center aspires to provide a platform for critical thinking, analysis, and ideas to confront challenges that affect our world. Please visit our website at palmbeachdemocracy.org. Tonight, the Palm Beach Center for Democracy and Policy Research is thrilled to present a compelling webinar, Latin America Challenges to the United States. Our four panelists are experts in their fields. In a moment, I will turn this over to Luis Fleischman, who will serve as the moderator and introduce the speakers. Luis's book, Latin America in the Post-Chavez Era, The Threat to U.S. Security, establishes Luis as an expert in this arena and as such, well-placed to moderate this event. We welcome your questions. You can write your question in the chat box. You can also email me your question to stephen@palmbeachdemocracy.org, and I'll post that in the chat box. With that, I turn it over to Luis.
Okay, Steve, thank you so much. I very much appreciate this. And thank you for your words. First of all, I want to take this opportunity to thank Maria Pistudot from Newslink for her invaluable help in putting together this program. Also, many thanks to our board member and marketing advisor, Brett Sandala, for also helping make tonight's event possible. And last and certainly not least, I want to thank our panelists for agreeing to speak at this program tonight. Now, why is this program relevant? Well, Latin America is our neighbor. Latin American countries are part of the Western Hemisphere, which is our neighborhood. Indeed, we are witnessing now Vice President Kamala Harris just completed a visit to Mexico and to Guatemala. And the purpose of the visit is helping these countries avoid mass invasion of immigrants and asylum seekers in our country by attempting to address the root causes of the misery that brings them to our country. But migration is certainly not the only problem we face in the Western Hemisphere. In the last 2 decades, we have seen the emergence of authoritarian revolutionary populist regimes. Venezuela took the lead and carried with it not only a group of revolutionary regimes in Bolivia, Nicaragua, and Ecuador. Some of these countries walked back their authoritarian populist path, like Ecuador, for instance. However, with the pandemics and serious other problems we are facing The return of anti-democratic forces in the continent, some of whom have also a clear anti-Semitic posture, is a fact. In Peru, we are facing a strong showing by a radical socialist candidate, Pedro Castillo, who is likely to be the next president, who received a huge support from the rural poor and the most dispossessed. Not a long time ago, we had the election of a president in Bolivia, who was basically a supporter of Evo Morales, one of probably the strongest allies of Venezuela in this coalition of authoritarian populist countries in the area. In that context, we are also looking at the increasing influence of China in the continent. China is gaining ground in various countries of Latin America. Likewise, we have in the continent an increasing presence of other rogue and unfriendly countries hostile to the United States, such as Russia and Iran, and non-state actors that add an element of chaos and anarchy to the region, such as transnational crime groups and even some terrorist groups. A key way that China, Russia, and Iran have become involved in the region is through sizable investments in strategic sectors such as mining, oil, and gas. The former Ecuadorian populist president Rafael Correa had basically embargoed Ecuador's oil futures to the Chinese in what we would call a ridiculous deal. A couple of months ago, Russia confirmed its intent to build 2 nuclear plants in Argentina, and Iran has been key in helping the Maduro regime in Venezuela to get some of its refineries back into production, in addition to helping Venezuela circumvent US sanctions. So tonight we will discuss the political and economic implications of these developments and what the Biden administration is doing or should be doing. Our panelists tonight are Luis Guillermo Solis. Luis Guillermo Solis has a long political and academic career. He served as the 47th president of the Republic of Costa Rica from the years 2014 to 2018. He is currently the interim director of the Kimberly Green Latin American and Caribbean Center at FIU in Miami, where he formerly also served as the director of the Central American Master's Program in Political Science. Politically, diplomatically, he was also co-chair of the UN Secretary General High-Level Panel on the Economic Empowerment of Women. Solis is a graduate of the University of Costa Rica and has a master's degree in history and political science from Tulane University. He has also taught in universities throughout the US and Europe, and he was also a Fulbright scholar at FIU, where he works today. And of course, he has also published extensively, including books and professional publications. He wrote books and professional journals, particularly on US Latin American relations and Central American history and politics. Dr. Evan Ellis is a research professor of Latin American studies at the US Army War College Strategic Studies Institute, with special focus on the region's relationship with China and other non-Western Hemisphere actors, as well as with transnational organized crime and populism in the region. Dr. Ellis has published over 300 works, including 4 books on the topic of China in Latin America, and now he's currently under contract for his 5th book, called China Engages Latin America, Distorting Development and Democracy. Dr. Ellis previously served also as on the Secretary of State's Policy Planning Staff, which is the think tank of the State Department, with special responsibility for Latin America and the Caribbean, as well as international narcotics and law enforcement issues. Joseph Humire is a global security expert specialized in analyzing transregional threats in the Western Hemisphere. He's the president and CEO of the Center for a Secure Free Society, a Washington, D.C. based think tank. Mr. Humire provides regular briefings and lectures on international terrorism, transnational organized crime, Islamism, Iran, and Hezbollah's influence in the Americas to various entities within the US national security community, as well as prominent think tanks and universities worldwide. He's also a regular national security commentator for a variety of major English and Spanish language media, including Univision, Telemundo, CNN en Español, Fox News, and he's also the editor of the 2014 book titled Iran's Strategic Penetration in Latin America. David Voght, our last speaker, is managing director of IPD Latin America, which is a consulting firm specializing in the oil, gas, and power markets. He has 30 years of experience in Latin America, 20 of those living in Venezuela. And he consults for international energy developers, service companies, financial institutions, and governments. His firm specializes in market intelligence with a focus on country risk, government relations, and energy policy. He is co-founder of the Madrid Energy Conference, an annual event that fosters energy investments and policy development between Europe and the Americas. And I know David Voght is right now in Madrid, and so he's doing this as a favor to us. We are really, really honored to have these panelists with us. Each speaker will speak for about 10 to 15 minutes. It will be followed by a question and answer period, first from me, the moderator, and then from the audience. Please write your questions on the chat, which will be later read by Dr. Sussman. I think Dr. Sussman also said that you can send him an email, and he gave you the email. So without further ado, I called on President Luis Guillermo Solis to come to the podium and make his presentation. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Luis. Good afternoon to all. I'm very honored to be able to participate in this activity, and I commend Luis, Stephen, and the Council for calling us to share some ideas on the relationship between the United States and Latin America and some of the challenges that we are facing these days. Luis was kind enough to ask me to talk about a variety of issues in 10 minutes, ranging from the state of democracy to specific cases throughout the region. And I'm sure I won't be able to do it, and certainly not with the depth that you all deserve. But let me try to do a 50,000 feet approach, as they say, that I'm certain my colleagues and distinguished co-panelists will be able to surpass in their wisdom and understanding of the region. The first topic Luis requested my opinion on is democracy in general. And clearly, liberal democracy as we know it is being challenged throughout the region. I would say it's being challenged throughout the hemisphere, including in the United States. This is not a phenomenon that is exclusive to Latin America. It's also happening in Europe. You saw President Macron being slapped in the face yesterday. There is a certain ire against elected officials for a number of reasons. But in Latin America, I would say that the problems democratic rule is experiencing results from the combination of a number of factors. And allow me to mention four that I find very important. First of all, what I would like to call the neo-authoritarianism that is resulting from populism. It has already been mentioned by Stephen. It has been a matter of discussion throughout the scholarly community. The second one is the weak or inexistent institutions that are required to support the rule of law. Democracy without the rule of law does not exist. I mean, you need to have a justice system that upholds a number of principles and values that ought to be respected by all. The third factor is massive corruption. And finally, but not least important, the growing inequality that is mostly resulting from unemployment to young people and the elderly. And especially in the case of the elderly, people who are being left aside of the road without no protection whatsoever from the social security institutions, without an insurance and without health services. These trends, of course, have been exacerbated by the COVID pandemic, the destruction that has been caused by extreme events in South America, in the Caribbean area, and in some cases, the activities of what we call malign actors. Robert and Joseph, I'm sure, will talk about that at length. We are now suffering from three dictatorships in this hemisphere: Cuba, Venezuela, and Nicaragua. But we are also seeing a number of countries under severe risk of becoming ungovernable in the coming years. Beginning with Peru, we have the situation in Bolivia, which is quiet right now. Same thing with Ecuador, Colombia, Guatemala, Honduras, and a case that I find extremely worrisome, which is the case of Haiti. Even in traditionally solid democratic countries like Costa Rica and Chile, we are seeing expressions of severe civic or and citizens discontent. And out of the, when I see the hemisphere, I only see Uruguay being, enjoying the stability for which it has been well known. I have not mentioned Mexico and Argentina and other examples, but I think that we all understand that regardless of the north being in the north or the south, being in the east or the west of the hemisphere, we're all suffering from this discontent with liberal democracy. The second issue Luis asked me to talk about was authoritarianism. And I think that this is something that we've seen in the Latin American political culture for a long, long time. We have authoritarian civilian rulers. We have authoritarian military rulers. Some are conservative. Some are leftists. And the issue with the authoritarianism has to do not so much with ideology, but with the management of power relations. And many countries have fallen to the authoritarian temptation due to the pervasive presence of or the lack of strong institutions, again, that can articulate political systems, the appeals to the strong man as something that we have seen many times over, and obviously, as of late, the appearance of the so-called populist leaders, who are not, again, necessarily ideologically motivated. I mean, some are, and have actually put forth a new epistemological platform like Hugo Chavez did with Socialismo del Siglo XXI. Clearly, I mean, that was an ideological proposal, but you find populists on the right as well. You have Bolsonaro, you have Bukele from El Salvador, and obviously you have Castillo and Evo Morales from the left. And then you have a variety of others throughout the world. I would include among the populists of the international system today, President Trump, the presidents or prime ministers of Central and Eastern Europe, Putin, Xi Jinping, Duterte, and the list goes on. I mean, and I'm not saying that they are all the same, but they share a number of very of common traits that I think are basically the ones that I've outlined. They're personalistic. They do not uphold the institutions of justice in great regard. They are forceful in the way they rule. And I think that they put in question many of the truths, so quote unquote, that the establishment has used. And then cases. Luis mentioned 5 cases. Colombia, I think it's a country with strong institutions, but it has a very deteriorated political climate. This is mostly the result of economic and social inequalities. I don't think Venezuela is to be blamed mostly for what Colombia is going through. They have not been able to put an end to the internal political conflicts. And what we see is a very severe questioning of the traditional political order. Also, of course, the situation in Venezuela has something to do, of course, with the situation in Colombia. But also Colombia experiences the breakdown of the traditional order within the political parties. As you know, former President Uribe is confronting the current president, and this, of course, is also repeated in other parties. So this is a very interesting situation developing there, with the possibility of the left coming to rule Colombia in the next election under Petro. In El Salvador, this is a very clear case where citizens are fed up with all the traditional order prior to the current president. They're angry. They have seen the presidents of El Salvador embezzled literally hundreds of millions of dollars. One of the former presidents of El Salvador is an asylee, received that condition by Ortega in Nicaragua, and he embezzled apparently something in the order of $350 million during his tenure, 5 years. But there are other presidents, some of whom are in jail. So the choosing of Bukele came as no surprise. He's probably the most popular president in Latin America today, but he is very much, he has proven to be very much in disregard of the Justice Administration, and I don't know where that may lead. I think that he is behaving as some of the, say, more established populists in Latin America behaved when they started, including Hugo Chavez in Venezuela, and I dread that this may be repeated in El Salvador. Mexico, they have another populist president, Andrés Manuel López Obrador. He is also very popular. His party, Morena, lost the majority, the absolute majority they had in the Congress and the Senate in the last elections past weekend, but he's still in control of the majority of the legislative. Mexico is going through extreme violence, a wave of extreme violence, and he still has 3 years to go. It'll be very interesting to see how the succession of López Obrador occurs. Peru is the latest case, and it's a very complicated case. Luis mentioned this. They had an election, a ballotage, a second round last week between a radical leftist and a person who has no prior experience, Pedro Castillo, and the daughter of Alberto Fujimori, who's been accused of serious acts of corruption. She was considered to be a national security threat by most of the parties, traditional and right-wing parties in Ecuador, in the Peru in the first round. And then she became the defender of the faith in the second round. And she has apparently lost by a very few votes with Pedro Castillo. But regardless of who won, the problem in Peru is that the legislative is completely fragmented into 19 political parties, and neither Fujimori nor Castillo control but a small minority of deputies within them and senators. So the problem here is that whoever is elected is going to confront a Congress that has been also very difficult to handle in previous administrations. So the country is fragmented ideologically, is fragmented geographically, and it's fragmented socially, because Fujimori and Castillo represent extreme groups of population. And finally, Nicaragua, where we're seeing the consolidation of a dictatorship that has been there for a long, long time. Let me just mention other issues that are affecting, in my perspective, the relationship with the Latin America of the United States. One, migrations. Two, the presence of China and Russia, especially in the Caribbean basin, but also in Argentina. Three, transnational organized crime. Four, the environment. And fifth, last but not least, how to deal with Venezuela and Nicaragua, which is, I think, one of the biggest questions we have to ponder this evening. Thank you very much, Luis. Back to you.
That's good.
Luis, you're on mute.
No, that's it. Thank you very much.
Yeah, no,
Back to you.
no, the other
Thank you
Luis.
so much.
Oh, the other Luis.
The
Yeah,
other
the other Luis is mute. Yeah.
You're
Okay.
president. He's Luis.
Okay. Dr. Ellis, the floor is yours. Thank you so much, President Solis.
Thank you very much. Well, first of all, I appreciate and I'm honored by the invitation, as well as the opportunity to share the podium first with my good friend and colleague, Joseph Humire, and particularly also the great honor of being able to share this with President Solis, with whom I had the greatest respect during his presidency. And it's not many people you find in the region who were equally distinguished as a scholar and then a president, and then again as a scholar. So a real honor to share the podium with the President Solis and to be part of this event. So I'm going to focus on the perspective of China and the role that China is playing in the region, but in many ways, as President Solis indicated, the relationship also between China and some of the other factors that you see with respect to populism, as well as some of the impacts of COVID-19. I'm going to share a presentation if I could be enabled to actually do screen sharing here. If not, I'll be happy to just speak.
Yes, give me. Let me give you sharing rights here. I'll make you the host. Okay, you should be the host now and should have ability.
Thank you very much. Okay. Okay, you should now see my presentation, Populism, China and COVID-19, Latin America's New Perfect Storm. It's available certainly as reference. I'm not going to have time in 15 minutes to go through the entirety, but let me just say a few quick things about the role of China in Latin America. First of all, we can recognize that it has grabbed the attention of the region, although it's principally been about the pursuit of economic objectives. The overall figure is about $160 billion of PRC investment in Latin America since it became a member of the World Trade Organization and really began to take off with that engagement in about 2001. In terms of loans, especially a China Development Bank and China Exim Bank, its two principal policy banks, it's put about 136 billion in loans into the region since 2005. This year has been a bit slower because of two things. One, so many projects have been just suspended because of COVID-19. And second, the ongoing collapse of Venezuela, which is one of its larger creditors. And then, of course, with respect to trade, about 314 billion in Chinese annual bilateral trade in 2019. Now, while that's overall somewhat less than the United States, when you look south, really, of the Northern Triangle states, you see in general that China has become generally the #1, or if it is the #2 trading partner, it is typically behind Brazil, with the United States coming in third. And in that sense of the importance of China to both the country's exports, usually focused on commodity exports and foodstuffs, as well as a potential suitor, is something that really gives China a lot of influence and power in the region, and increasingly so. The other thing that you see from the profile here is that you've seen an exponential increase, but there's really two phases. There was a large increase that was largely around purchases of commodities and the sale of commodities and the purchase of goods. And after the global economic crisis of 2008, 2009, you saw a much greater expansion of China's physical presence in some sectors such as mining and petroleum and agriculture through mergers and acquisitions. In others, such as telecommunications and logistics and some light manufacturing, that was built a little bit more from the ground up. But that presence over the years has not only given Chinese companies an opportunity to learn very quickly on the ground how to be more effective partners, oftentimes starting out in very difficult situations in terms of problems with relations with local communities and governments and labor forces. But it's also made China increasingly focused on how the conditions on the ground in the region impact it. In general, I find it useful understanding China's strategy and focus to look at three different sectors. So on the one hand, you have the things that it's increasingly doing, buying commodities as well as investing in those sectors, really to have secure access to the things that China most needs for its own production, industrialization, capital formation. And this includes, again, not only petroleum and mining products and agricultural products, but also such things as timber and fishing products. On the other side, certain high value-added sectors. China is very focused globally in moving up the value-added ladder and being in a dominant position in industries where there is a lot of value added in terms of manufacturing, telecommunications, computers, robotics, AI, and things like that. And overlapping with that is what you see on the bottom there, this connectivity and digital activities. So a lot's been said about China's Belt and Road Initiative, which extended to Latin America and the Caribbean in 2018, and now has 19 adherents in the region, probably 20 after Argentina joins in an expected state visit this year. But it's not just about operating ports and building roads and even operating some riverine toll routes, which is something very important going on right now in the Paraguay-Paraná river corridor, responsible for significant agricultural exports from Brazil, Uruguay, Argentina, and also in Peru, but also other areas that you wouldn't think of in terms of connectivity, such as the generation of electricity, transmission, and distribution. China's put about $20 billion into transmission and generation, as well as other energy sector activities in Brazil. In Peru, investments have allowed it to capture about 50% of the distribution market in the greater Lima area. In Chile, 5 major acquisitions, including the most recent acquisition of CGE just approved, means that it will control over 57% of the nation's entire electricity grid. When you add that on top of China's increasing role in the telecommunications market, as well as e-commerce and finance and other types of connectivity, you realize that this goes much beyond Belt and Road. It's really a very dominant position in the fundamental glue that allows Latin American economies to function, which gives China increasing leverage also as they pursue their objectives in resources and other things. If you look at this picture, what you see also is the key point I really wanted to make what this all means. Often there's the presumption that this is like the Cold War, where China is looking to set up client states or military things. For me, I see this as mostly about China pursuing its own objectives. It's about China orchestrating a world which is whose value flows are favorable to it. And to that regard, I see that many of the activities, China moves into a sector with many deals. It uses that economic position to get political leverage, but often it uses that political leverage, yes, to get politicians not to do certain things that would be offensive to China, but also for more economic leverage, to expand its economic position. There is also increasingly military activities and security engagement in the region, but I tend to see these things as, for the moment, largely in support of its principally economic activities. In the interest of time, I won't go into the details of the sector, although I mentioned some of these, but just a few things I want to highlight with respect to China's digital activities. You've probably heard a lot about 5G, and as well as some of China's smart cities projects and other things. One of the concerns, this is not just about military secrets, but it's about the very communication architectures in which not only military, but also government data flows, the communications of government personnel, but also, frankly, investors and companies who use these networks. We've seen in the past how China looks to use its security services to help its companies to advance in China itself. And with China's 2017 national security law, the risk is clearly there that as companies like Huawei dominate these networks, it really puts commercial secrets, the personal behaviors and sensibilities of leaders at risk in ways that can compromise them, and really at the end of the day, begin to compromise the sovereignty of Latin American states. There's another thing that's useful to call attention to here within populism, because I'm going to talk about it a little bit more later, which is this concept of locking in digital authoritarianism. So, for example, with Venezuela, the One of the things that China did, a company called CEIEC was called out by our State Department for basically helping the Maduro regime spy on the opposition, de jure President Juan Guaido and others. Another thing that they did, however, was helping to set up a system called the Fatherland Identity Card. And that card was not only used for voting, but the distribution of scarce food supplies, the famous clap boxes, as well as more recently the distribution of badly needed vaccines, largely coming from China and secondarily Russia. The risk is China also begins to help out its authoritarian friends with other types of things. For example, China is rolling out its own digital currency, the digital yuan or renminbi this year. The expectation then is that China would help its friendly regimes set up their own digital currency, giving those friendly regimes the same type of vision and control over their financial systems and transactions that China is hoping to get over its own. In other words, a lot of things that China can do electronically to help its friends to have control over its own population and resistance in the same way that China does at home. In the process, meaning that when countries flip over, so to speak, to more authoritarian styles of governance, as President Solis eloquently spoke to, that China's support, both financial and technological, provides a type of lock-in effect that we have not seen with previous cycles of authoritarian populism in the region. And so what I really want to end on is what worries me very much about where the region is going. And again, President Solis alluded to this. I see really a confluence of three very worrisome factors. Obviously, COVID-19 has changed the framework, not only in health terms, but also it's deepened the economic crisis. It's worsened significantly the fiscal position of governments. A lot of the problems in Colombia right now were set off by the need to do fiscal reform, tax increases, and things like that. It's increased the options that criminal groups have. It has increased opportunities and levels for corruption, as we've seen in Colombia, in Chile, in many places, even in Costa Rica. It's fueled social unrest coming out of these sources of discontent. It's destabilized governments. I mean, in many ways, not only what we see in Colombia, but some of the outcome of the elections, where again, you have the rebellion of Sierra and Selva, in Peru, Cajamarca. Part of the phenomena of Pedro Castillo is the phenomenon of pushing back against the sense of neglect in the context of this great suffering. And so the risk is that as you bring more populist governments to power and more instability, in many ways it opens up the door, first of all, for Chinese influence, as well as just those governments. China has already done this through their vaccines and other forms of assistance. Their demand for commodities in these difficult times, Brazilian soy, Argentine beef becomes very important. The prospect of increasing their footprint on the ground, as they did in the 2009-2010 period, by basically buying up the interests of Western companies as they try to get out of the poorly performing Latin American markets. What I call the Taiwan effect. Vulnerable countries, such as we're already seeing with Juan Orlando Hernandez in Honduras, as they set up, as they pursue the China market, maybe even flip to recognizing the PRC, that opens the door for rapid expansion of Chinese influence there. And frankly, the more that you have these populist governments, the more that opens up the door. Those governments have historically been more willing to do more government-to-government deals and more type of intrusive security and technological cooperation relationships in more worrisome ways. And then, as I indicated too, as those type of relationships deepen, the PRC oftentimes serves as an incubator as these populist governments. The populist governments didn't come to power because of China. It's not like the Soviet model, but once they came to power, Hugo Chavez, Rafael Correa in Ecuador, Evo Morales in Bolivia, the first round with Cristina Fernandez de Kirchner in Argentina, Chinese funding oftentimes gave them the support that they needed to be able to keep their followers happy while they turned away from the West, worked against private property, worked against the political opposition, changed the rules of the game. And so it's an incubation, And of course, now as that relationship is deepened, it's helped them to survive and continues to help them to survive.
Hello.
And help. The concern thus is that
Hey, me, how are you?
you have a cycle that moves in a very disturbing
okay.
direction. So those are my remarks. And again, I look forward to Joseph's remarks and the question and answer period that comes after.
Thank you, Dr. Ellis. That has been really enlightening, and I'm sure it's raising already a lot of questions I'm seeing in the chat, which is great. And don't forget to return the host, I think, to Steve Sussman. Our next speaker is Joseph Humire. Joseph, the floor is yours.
Okay, first of all, let me just make sure everyone can hear me. Luis, can you hear me?
Perfectly.
Yes.
Okay, roger that. Well, like my great colleague, Dr. Evan Ellis, and President Solis, it's a great privilege and honor to be with you here today. Congratulations to Luis and Stephen for launching the Palm Beach Center for Democracy and Policy Research, a much needed effort, I imagine, in Florida. I hope to be able to visit you one day in person, but we'll do the virtual seminar for now. And again, it's also a great honor to always hear Evan. Evan is one of the best experts on China, Latin America. I learned a lot from him over the years, and it's a great honor and privilege to share the virtual platform with President Solis, one of the true political scholars and former presidents of the region. That really comes back to something that we are appreciating more and more over time, because many of the leaders in Latin America and in the world are showing more autocratic tendencies than what we've seen in previous years. Like President Solis, I'm going to attempt to give you a kind of 50,000-foot overview on the region, but I'm going to drill into a couple specific things to try to give it some context. And I have to apologize also ahead of time, because due to some prior commitments, I'll have to leave a little shortly after 8 p.m. So I might not stick around for all the Q&A, but I will leave my contact information in the chat box, so that people that they want to contact me, feel free to email me and ask me any question. So let me begin my remarks by using a quote, actually, and it's not a famous quote because it's a quote that just happened that I heard actually at a previous seminar, but it was a quote said by a very prominent politician that's very involved in Latin American and European affairs. And I'll tell you the politician in a second, but first I'd like to read the quote, and I'm paraphrasing a bit here because he said it in Spanish, but this quote goes as such. He says, nothing that happens in Chile, Colombia, Peru, Nicaragua, Venezuela, or anywhere can be explained without understanding the influence of Russia, China, and Iran. And if you don't understand this, it's because you don't understand anything. It's not my words, these are words, actually the words of former Spanish Prime Minister Jose Maria Aznar, spoken at a recent forum, an Ibero-American forum on May 24th in Quito, Ecuador, on the eve of the inauguration of President Guillermo Lasso. Those words struck me and they stuck with me, because I think this is an important point to start this conversation. What is the international order today? Latin America is no longer in isolation, if it ever was in isolation, but it cannot think it lives in isolation from a larger geopolitical context. In the 21st century, we live in a multipolar world. This is much different than the bipolar world that was for much of the Cold War with the United States and the Soviet Union. Today, there's the emergence of other powers in different parts of the world, particularly China in Asia, Russia in Central Eastern Europe, and Iran in the Middle East, that have their own hegemonic ambitions. They have their own projections of what they want to see in the international order, and they have their own methods of how they're going to attain that. I think you could go back to the 1970s and see how some of these shifts started to take place when China entered the international order per se, through entering into different multilateral agencies, or the Iranian Revolution in 1979, or Russia's resurgence after the fall of the wall after the end of the Cold War. This in Washington, D.C. vernacular has been termed as great power competition, although I like to refer to more as great power conflict, because I think the competition is becoming much more adversarial as time persists, things particularly before and after COVID-19. In that, there's a narrative around that, but there's also a very practical policy aspect of it, especially if you read the national security strategy of the White House. I know Evans worked on this as a member of the State Department's Policy Planning Office, because it was quite a shift for most of us that grew up in the national security space during the post 9/11 security environment. Most of us had a lot of focus on counterterrorism. Counterterrorism dominated a lot of the conversations when it comes to national security policy. I for sure grew up in the counterterrorism community, whether it's looking at international terrorism or even in some cases looking at Latin American terrorism. Remember the surge of the FARC during the early part of the 21st century. But the shift into great power competition, to me, isn't mutually exclusive from counterterrorism, because I believe the terrorist threats still persist. The convergence with transnational organized crime is something that's real, but that GPC allows us to at least understand that there's a greater global geopolitical context and construct that we have to understand, to see how globalization has affected both positively, and I think in most respects positively, but to some level it has benefited some illicit actors as well. In that, I want to dive into two specific things, which are the modalities, new modalities, and new networks that have emerged in this century. And when I say new, I'm speaking about like in the long version of new, the last 20 years or so, not necessarily in the last few years. In terms of networks, I think it's interesting to look at the region in at least three different blocks, three different groupings. President Solis, I think, mentioned this, and Evan obviously talked about this as well. I tend to look at these more malign actors, regional actors, as a threat network. In the national security and the counterterrorism community, we would often look at certain states that sponsor terrorism as a threat network, like the Iran threat network. And so I look at this as the Bolivarian threat network, or the Venezuela threat network. And this obviously includes Venezuela, Cuba, Nicaragua, and I would include Bolivia in there, even though there was an attempt to divorce itself from the autocratic methods of its previous regime under Evo Morales, but seems like it's moving back into that orbit under President Arce. But I think Nicaragua is one that particularly is causing a lot of attention. I think, as we have seen over the last few days, the incarceration of presidential contenders, Cristina Chamorro, also Felix Maradiaga. Felix Maradiaga is a good friend. I know for Evan, so I know Felix for more than 12 years. I think it is a grave injustice. We're seeing essentially what we saw in 2014 and 2017 in Venezuela now start to implement itself in Nicaragua, where they're consolidating what was already a very autocratic country. And we're seeing that some of those signs in Bolivia with the incarceration of former President Jenny Yanez under trumped up charges that haven't yet been shown to have proof. I would shift that, so you have the threat network in one category. The second category I would call shadow supporters, because these are countries that perhaps still maintain at least an element of legitimacy on the international stage, mostly because of their size and their history, but also have a level of credibility when it comes to the international order, particularly in international markets and trade. However, these countries are increasingly moving towards the autocratic realm and provide support to some of these specific actors in the threat network. I'm referring specifically to Argentina and Mexico. Argentina and Mexico are very important countries with very important institutions, both security institutions and economic institutions, that are unfortunately being governed more and more in populist manners, but manners that are taking the country more towards the autocratic direction of the threat network. And in many cases, and in specific, I would mention Argentina, providing political support and sometimes shadow support to some of these more malign actors, namely the Maduro regime in Venezuela. Underneath that, in the shadow supporter category, there are spoilers like El Salvador, who don't really know politically where they fit, because I wouldn't classify the Bukele government as a right-wing government. I don't know if it's right or left. It's certainly populist, but it has a lot of hidden and mysterious elements that are beyond the rhetoric of the president And if you dig deep into some of those networks, you find connections into the same threat network that we're talking about. So you have the threat network, you have the shadow supporters, then you have the democracies that are under assault, and you have the region as a whole. But some of these democracies, one by one, are facing tremendous challenges, challenges that aren't normal. These aren't the same challenges they faced in the past. These are similar tendencies with much more exacerbated methods. I would put Colombia in that category. We've definitely watched this last month and a half or so, where that country's had a tremendous social and political crisis. Chile has gone through this already in 2019. That has now led to a constitutional process to potentially rewrite their current constitution. Peru obviously is going through a very contentious election. I put Brazil in this category too, because even though there are comparisons that you can make between President Bolsonaro and President Lopez Obrador on the surface, I think if you dig beneath the surface, those aren't comparable at all. The program that President Lopez Obrador is doing in Mexico has both autocratic underpinnings and has a revolutionary transformation framework, the 14 revolution. Brazil has none of that. President Bolsonaro is not trying to fundamentally change Brazil in terms of its democratic institutions, nor is he have an autocratic underpinning beneath him. In fact, if anything, I think he is one of the democracies under assault by both the malign actors and some of their shadow supporters. And in that, so once we understand the new network that's kind of informing over time in the region, we have to understand the new modalities, the new methods. And in that, I'm going to highlight two, and for lack of time, I'm not going to be able to dig into these two, but I could certainly be happy to send you reports or writings that we've done to analyze these. And these new methods are: one, mass migration, and two, mass protests. These are normal activities. These are historic activities. These are things that have been happening in the region for a very long time. Everybody that pays attention to the region, all of us, know that migration and protests are as normal in Latin America, unfortunately, but they are since we've been observing the region. However, these normal activities are becoming irregular over time, and in some instances are becoming weaponized by certain actors that are looking to destabilize the region. In the terms of mass migration, I will point to the caravans in Central America of 2018, something I have firsthand experience researching, looking on the ground in Guatemala. And without boring you with, that's not essentially a boring story, but without getting into the details, I'm going to give you the upshot, which is that the caravans of 2018 were not a regular form of mass migration. It wasn't about the root causes, socioeconomic conditions, and high levels of insecurity in Central America. Those were the motivations of the migrants, but it wasn't the motivation of the political actors that were pushing and organizing and shaping the narrative around the migrants. The purpose of the caravans in 2018 was not to come and bring a lot of migrants into the United States. They understood, especially when President Trump militarized the border, and especially when President Lopez Obrador employed the National Guard, that was next to impossible. The purpose of the caravans, not by the migrants, because the migrants are literally the victims in this, but the purpose of the political forces that pushed the migrants was to create conflict along the borders up into the United States, the Guatemalan-Honduran border, the Guatemalan-Mexican border, the Mexican-United States border, to be able to weaken the border and by extension, weaken national sovereignty. And I think that what we're seeing today at the border crisis, currently I came back from Texas about a month ago, where it's truly we have a capacity problem on the border. I think that's just the beginning of a much broader crisis. I think the caravans in 2018 served a lot of lessons for some of these malign actors, and they're going to look to continue to use that as a destabilizing force. Not to mention that Central America is not even the biggest mass migration crisis in the hemisphere, being that we have Venezuela and the 5.5 or 5.6 million refugees and migrants that have fled that country since 2014, or even Haiti, as President Solis mentioned, where you have 500,000 migrants that have left since 2018. So when these three migration patterns connect, if they do connect, and there's signs that they are connecting, that's going to make the border crisis today look like a walk in the park to what can happen in the future. Just as a small anecdote on that, we're already seeing the Venezuelan migration connect in that in the whole year of 2019, there were no more than a little over 2,000 Venezuelan migrants that arrived to the border, the US Southwest border with Mexico. And just in the month of April, there were more than 6,000 just in 1 month. So they're already seeing that happen. The second is the mass protests, and we did some work and study in Chile in 2019. We worked on this in 2020 after the Chilean protests, and we all remember the riots that happened over a legitimate grievance, which was the hiking of public transport. I believe it was 4 cents hike on the public transport, but definitely did not necessitate the reaction, which happened very violently, where essentially the subway system in Santiago was destroyed, attacks on police stations, attacks on military installations, basically chaos and anarchy for a few months that led to the negotiations and now to the Constituent Assembly. But the most important lesson of the Chile situation, and this is very important for Colombia, was the high level of disinformation that was used in that. That's not to take anything away from the legitimate grievances that are expressed by the protesters, just like the caravan should take anything away from the real motivations of the migrants. Those are the victims in these situations, the migrants and the protesters. But there was high levels of foreign disinformation. In one study that we participated in, you had 1% in an ecosystem of about 7 million digital interactions. You had 1% of the accounts generating more than 30% of the content. And of that 1% of the accounts, more than 70% were accounts geolocated to Cuba, Venezuela, or Russia. So these weren't necessarily Chileans that were amplifying the information. And with that, I know I'm running short on time, so I'll just end with where I think we should go with this, and where I think the Biden administration should work on this in the region. Latin America is in peril. I think there's no doubt about it. It is perhaps the region most affected economically by the pandemic, with the figures from the World Bank and the IMF last year of 8.4 contraction in GDP on average for the region. Many countries that lost a decade of economic growth in 1 year, and more than I think 53 million people falling below the poverty line. Latin America is in a tremendous economic challenge for a region that always has had economic challenges. Those are obviously going to play into the social and political construct that democracies in the region are going to be challenged as we're seeing. But I think for the Biden administration, it's not enough to just say, don't follow China. It's not enough to just say, we need to, let me make sure I hang this up. It's not enough to say, we need to defend human rights and democracy, or we need to fight against corruption. The message needs to be about something that we are offering, something that we connect with. We need to sell in Latin America. We need to sell Americanism, both with a capital A, the Pan-American vision. We need to sell the connection, the cultural, demographic, in some cases even religious connections we have with the region that China, Russia, and Iran do not have, even though they have been in the region for a while now, and they're trying to grow those elements, but they do not have that. And I believe at the crux and at the heart of our challenges in Latin America go beyond democracy. At the heart of the challenges are the underpinnings that allow a democracy to function, which are principally individual liberty and national sovereignty. We need to defend individual liberty and national sovereignty with our partners in Latin America, because if they don't understand that within their identity, they're going to be dismantled. And so I think I'll end with that. And I, again, appreciate very much being a part of this panel. I enjoyed all the remarks. I'll stick around for a little bit for if there's questions or so, but I'll have to leave in a little bit. So I apologize in advance for that. Thank you, Luis, once again. It was a pleasure to see everyone connected tonight.
Thank you so much, Joseph, and thank you so much for your perspective. Now we have our last speaker is David Voght. David, the floor is yours.
Well, good evening, everyone. And Stephen and Luis, thank you so much for the invitation to be here tonight. I am a big fan of your 3 other speakers. I use their information constantly in order to kind of form the opinions of my own little world, which is much more micro than theirs. We are looking really specifically at the Venezuelan oil industry. So maybe my comments here today, we could take them as sort of a case study, a much more specific look at what we've heard from your first 3 speakers. I think in general, to start, we could start by framing this in terms of the relationship between the United States and Venezuela and how much it's changed over the last 20 years. And most of that change had to do with Hugo Chavez and his views of what a multipolar world should look like, a world in which the US would not be so dominant. Hugo Chavez was willing to put Venezuelan oil behind his desire to make this multipolar world happen, okay? In 1997, this was the year that Venezuela exported the most oil to the United States. Venezuela exported 1.7 million barrels a day to the United States. 10 years later, in 2007, they exported 1.37 million. 10 years later, 674,000 barrels a day. That was in 2017. Today, in 2021, they're exporting 0 barrels a day. So there's now a disconnect, and the reasons for the United States, which were previously primarily energy security, they've shifted, and therefore U.S. engagement has shifted. I think that the shale gas movement in the United States has given the U.S. sort of a sense of security with regards to energy supply, and for that reason, Venezuela has sort of fallen on the back burner to a certain extent with regards to policy and hemispheric security. Now, I guess I would say that Jose Maria Aznar is pretty spot on. Russia and China have influenced the political situation in Venezuela dramatically. I would say Iran to a much lesser extent, but still very much. First of all, let's take a look at China. So Hugo Chavez's first visit to Beijing was in 1999. His relationship development with the country eventually led to billions of dollars of loan for oil agreements, which were signed between 2007 and 2014. At the time, China was looking for long-term energy supply from Venezuela. And one could absolutely consider that Venezuela was part of China's plan, again, to drive that value to China, to ensure the different types of resources that China's economy needs to grow. For Chavez, these agreements provided critical financial support at the end of a major oil industry investment cycle. Essentially, we had just seen the last investment of the previous government, where PDVSA had brought in foreign companies to invest and build mega projects. Particularly, I'm speaking of these heavy crude upgrading projects, multi-billion-dollar projects, and Chavez was waiting for that last project to finalize before he then moved to migrate all of these operating service agreements and service contracts to joint ventures where PDVSA would take control of the operations. And you know, this was all done sort of in a very chaotic period. And this migration process essentially triggered a sharp crude production decline. So China coming in at this time was really important for Chavez. They signed 171 bilateral and trade agreements between 2004 and 2016. And China loaned Venezuela over $60 billion. And what did that result in? It really didn't result in a whole lot. There were really no major infrastructure projects built. There was a power plant, and that project ended up having some friction between the Chinese and PDVSA in terms of the management and the transfer of the operations of the plant. You know, most of these loans they were tied to Chinese imports. One of the things that China did very intelligently, it made all of these loans short-term loans tied to crude exports. And so it got paid back for the most part. But let's take a look at what happened in the oil industry. China National Petroleum Company, CNPC, has 5 oil joint ventures today with PDVSA. Only one of those joint ventures, which should be producing 330,000 barrels a day, is currently producing 60,000 barrels a day. That's it. That's what CNPC has today. It's also, this project is a project that CNPC was in well before Chavez. It was an ore emulsion project. And essentially, Chavez reconfigured the project because he didn't like bitumen. He wanted to distance that project from the previous government. And so he kind of reconfigured it, and CNPC started exporting essentially diluted crude oil. Now, China's colossal investment strategy found itself at a crossroads with the growing disjointedness of the Venezuelan political situation. And I think that's something that we've seen in the comments so far tonight. Weak institutions, weak rule of law, severe risk of ungovernability. You know, in my opinion, the Chinese have actually become disengaged in Venezuela to a certain extent, at least in the oil industry. They're not making new investments. They're not aggressively going after new assets. You know, to be honest, I think that even if they had the chance, they would not. They have not made a single investment since, they've not made a single loan since 2016. And on top of that, and this is not necessarily entirely because Venezuela is an unreliable business partner, they've stopped lifting crude directly from Venezuela. This is primarily due to US sanctions. And I think that that's really important. And if we have time, we'll talk a little bit more about sort of what the current situation is with crude. But I want to just mention that the story is very similar with Russia. Between 2004 and 2011, Russia and Venezuela signed 58 bilateral agreements. They closed billions of dollars in arms deals. And the Russian oil companies Gazprom Bank, Rosneft, Lukoil, Surgutneftegas, TNK-BP, they were all in Venezuela looking for projects. Now, the perfect example of how this doesn't work out for them is with a heavy crude upgrading project called Petromiranda. In June of 2010, a consortium made up of Rosneft, Lukoil, TNK, BP, Gazprom, and Surgutneftegas incorporated to form this Petromiranda heavy crude upgrading project. And eventually, because of the sort of the dysfunctionality of PDVSA, all of the companies except for Rosneft left the country. They just got exhausted trying to make their projects happen. Rosneft consolidated a 40% stake in that project, which today is producing 1,000 barrels a day. Rosneft's crown jewel, which is Petromonagas, the former ExxonMobil heavy oil project, which Rosneft inherited through its merger with TNK BP, currently produces 47,000 barrels a day. The project produced 150,000 barrels a day on average in 2018. So I just want to set the framework there that these companies, just because they are Russian or Chinese, are not necessarily favored over other companies. They're experiencing the same problems in Venezuela as all of the other companies: human resource issues, infrastructure issues. Power supply is a massive problem that brings down oil production very consistently in the country, and it's a real problem for the Russians as well. Sanctions have had an impact on the Russians. They started to actually pick up PDVSA slack and market PDVSA's crude to the point where they were marketing over 60% of PDVSA's crude at one point. But then I think it was February of 2020, the US slapped sanctions on Rosneft and had to stop marketing PDVSA's crude. Now, what has all this sort of resulted in? The sanctions regime in Venezuela is, the US sanctions regime in Venezuela is very interesting. The US government considers that it has achieved something here by essentially avoiding that Maduro will get his hands on about $40 billion of oil revenue. That's what they calculate the US sanctions have resulted in terms of a decline in oil exports and a detachment of Maduro from the oil business. That's a very good point. And I think if we can imagine what Maduro would have done with that much money, we would be in a very different position today than we are now, on the cusp of some sort of negotiation, which may or may not have a good end in the foreseeable future. I think that there are some unintended consequences of the sanctions. Obviously, no sanctions regime is ever perfect, but for us, one of the things that the sanctions have done is they've opened the door to Iran. Iran has come in and it's picked up a role in Venezuela by which it supplies gasoline. Now, it's not a lot of gasoline. Let's face it. They've done 5.6 million barrels of gasoline, condensate, and alkylates between May 20 and April 2021. It's only about 7,000 barrels a day of gasoline. So I think we do want to take a look and say, what is the real support that Iran is providing Venezuela? And in many cases, that support from a political perspective is public relations. The other thing that sanctions has done is that it's pushed the entirety, and I'm talking about just about the entirety. There's still some crude going to Cuba, and some different countries eventually, but it has pushed the entirety of Venezuelan crude trade to China. And it is ensuring economic gain for that country. It's also allowing China the possibility to repay debt owed to China. That's something that we're really unclear about. We see a lot of cargoes going as swaps, and we don't know exactly what they're swapping for. We do believe that some of those swaps could be for debt. But the issue here is that today we have a bunch of phantom traders. So we have no transparency at all in Venezuela's crude trade, moving crude through Malaysia and Singapore, disguising it as diluted bitumen, and then sending over to China, to the Chinese independents, that crude. And I think that there we need to look very much at the transparency and the sort of levels of corruption that are coming along with the need to trade in this fashion due to US sanctions. Finally, I would just close and say that from a policy perspective, I really hope that the US is going to look at the longer term when it comes to its sanctions regime, in particular at the stability and the sustainability of an eventual new government in the country. Right now, the joint venture partners, the international oil companies that are doing business in Venezuela, are they're very close to leaving the country. They have billions of dollars owed to them in debt and dividends. They can't get cash flow out of the country. They can't maintain their assets. That means they can't guarantee safety for their workers. They can't guarantee environmental safety. They are really at their wits' end. If these companies leave Venezuela, that will sort of put the nail in the coffin, because it will be literally impossible for the next government to increase oil production sufficiently or quickly enough to guarantee revenue to sustain itself. So we do need to see some creativity in the sanctions regime. We really need to look at the possibility for these companies to lift some cargoes, get some cash flow going, convince their shareholders to stay in the country, and to guarantee the integrity of these assets. I guess I'll stop there.
Okay, thank you so much, David. That has been terrific, and I know we are running a little bit out of time. We heard the different views this evening. Some people believing that having different ideas about the role of China. In the case of Dr. Ellis, sees basically an attempt of China to expand economically. For Joseph Humire, that unfortunately had to leave, China is basically one of the actors that is trying to change the face of Latin America and the relation between the United States and Latin America. And of course, there are some who actually bring us, like David, brought us some realistic ideas about some nuances about this relation between foreign countries and the oil industry in Venezuela in light of sanctions. I had several questions of my own, but since I want to respect the fact that the audience actually came here, I would like to transfer the Q&A to the audience. And
Okay, Luis.
yes.
Yeah, we have someone emailed me a question, so
Okay.
I could ask that. It's actually, there are 4 questions, and I'm not sure whether she wants me to identify her provider name or not, but I'll just ask the questions. Let me ask all 4 questions, and then you could respond. And these are coming directly from the person. How would you evaluate the effectiveness? And it isn't, she doesn't identify a particular speaker. How would you evaluate the effectiveness of Vice President Harris's visit and message warning Central Americans not to make the dangerous journey to the US? That's one. Haven't academics been analyzing and identifying the root causes of migration in the region for decades? How effective is the DFC in contributing to the development of Latin America? What are your thoughts about the DFC? And lastly, is it possible to compare Trumpism to Peronismo, although one ideology is leftist and the other conservative? Peronismo, I'm sorry. Can we look at the nature of Peronismo's longevity to explain the potential longevity and the survival of Trumpism, taking advantage of the media, projecting the voices of the people, and so on and so forth? There you go. 4 questions, if you can remember them all. Whoever would like to take it.
President Solis, would you like to start?
Well, let me just make a couple of observations, and not on all causes, on all the questions, but you know, it's very difficult to assess the effectiveness of the vice president's trip just based on a phrase that she uttered during the visit. We don't know the context in which that phrase, we know the context, but we know what other things she mentioned, you know, and I think it is unfair to judge the vice president simply because she said that they should not come. I mean, this is something that has been said before, and you know, it's more or less expected. I mean, what were we expecting? The vice president saying that they could come, or that you know. But anyway, I think that the administration has a larger plan. I have voiced a number of concerns regarding the plan and how that money is going to be invested. But I think they are approaching the migration issue with a much broader perspective than the phrase that she mentioned. And the other thing is, you know, as a historian, I tend to be very careful in making comparisons, especially with, you know, with political systems and governments that are so much separated in time between, you know, like Trump's and Perón's. I think that there are very different moments. These represent very different moments. Even if you can see some similarities, you have to be very careful with that. You know, one area in which I know that many people here feel very close to is, you know, these recurrent comparisons people do with Hitler. You know, Hitler was a monster. He was one of his kind. I don't think that one should go around comparing people with Hitler, because that degrades how bad he was. I mean, this is a monster. He killed 6 million people. You cannot go around saying that such and such is a monster and he is another Hitler. Well, I don't think that you should do that in general. We should look for, or should be very careful about analogies. And I fear that sometimes, because regimes tend to be similar in some ways, but one may reach conclusions that are not relevant.
Thank you.
Dr. Ellis, would you like to say something, or?
Yes, yeah, a couple quick things, and certainly agree with President Solis that some of these characterizations are very difficult to make. But in the interest of responding to the question, I'll say a few things purely my own. With respect to Vice President Harris's visit, I think one of the challenges, I mean, she's been assigned a very hard problem that indeed Vice President, when President Biden was Vice President, Central America and especially the Northern Triangle states were his portfolio. So sometimes in seeing that this was assigned to her, I'm not sure whether it was a gesture of faith, understanding the importance because he himself had this role, or because it's such an intractable problem and maybe he just doesn't like Vice President Harris very much. I say that as a joke, of course. My concern, there is, I think there are certain good elements. I think the chemistry between Vice President Harris and AMLO was important in later visits. I think some of the messaging and things were relatively good. Agree with President Solis that taken out of context, that phrase did not work well for her. There was certainly another one. It made me frankly worry about the fact that some of the messaging and pressures that come from a domestic U.S. audience are a bit out of sync with a Latin American audience. The idea of help is on the way, I worry reflects a deeper part of the American left, that we in the United States are benevolently helping bring democracy and human rights to the poor little brown people of Latin America. And I think that did not play well. It was not particularly respectful, although I'm sure that was not her intention. Beyond that, I would say I also worry about the ability to address some of the root causes. I think clearly the economic causes are often focused on, but clearly the security causes, as well as the question of the incentives that cause migrants to come, which obviously has a lot to do with the incentives on the U.S. side of the border. So when Joseph, for example, was talking about the jump in Venezuelan migrants, the fact that you actually had new opportunities for Venezuelan TPS that wasn't there before under President Trump, had a piece of it. And frankly, given some of the other pressures, again, there were some relatively small token projects, and we've seen token projects before. So I think it remains to be seen the implementation and the scale and the follow through. Similarly, with respect to DFC, I'm worried about, frankly, first of all, DFC has some serious constraints. It's like trying to herd cats, although it's better than what you had before with OPEC, but it's like trying to herd cats to get U.S. companies to invest and create the right positions, especially when you begin to constrain what DFC can do with certain other not necessarily economically directed policy issues, like a focus on it has to be green, et cetera, et cetera. And frankly, I'm also worried about the complement to DFC, America Crece, which again, that was the other administration, but I think DFC alone is being asked to handle a lot. And then finally, very much agree with President Solis regarding some of the comparisons, although in a moment of uncertainty, I wasn't sure whether, which one shouldn't be compared to Hitler, Trump, or Perón. But I think one of the critical, to me, beyond the comparison of leaders, having lived through that moment, I believe that it also shows the United States in a very human light. It shows that the U.S. doesn't have a perfectly institutionalized Jeffersonian democracy, and preaching to the rest of the region. The same disillusionment with the system and the rules and the leaders and things like that have made so many Latin American governments so frustrated for so long, also affect the United States. in our choices and in our leadership. And so in many ways, although it's something that can drive us apart, I also see something that shows both as a teaching point to the United States as well as to the region that we are all affected by these impulses to challenge. And again, it was something that President Solis so well said. The risk is not just to democracy in Latin America; it's to democracy in institutions and processes globally, in the United States, in Central and Eastern Europe, and in lots of places. But what happens in Latin America is particularly important to us because we are so intimately connected to this region in our prosperity, in our security.
David, I don't know whether you want to add something about the Harris part.
Well, I think maybe from a broader perspective, obviously Northern Triangle is critical to the United States and should be receiving a lot of attention. I think that in other parts of Latin America, we're seeing concern that the Biden administration is not paying as much attention or given as much urgency as it is to the Northern Triangle. That is, I guess maybe there's just a couple points there. First of all, we wonder if the Biden administration is still ramping up. If we're still seeing positions being approved by the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. We're seeing key decision makers not yet confirmed in their positions at the State Department, and we're, I guess, guessing, and I don't know if President Solis or Dr. Ellis have an opinion on this, but we're guessing that policy is still being formed, and in a lot of cases, maybe some people are waiting for these positions to be confirmed. I think that might also be the case with DFC as well. We had a call with them a couple of weeks ago, and it seems like there's a lot of people that want to do some things that just can't be done yet as the administration sort of ramps up. So I'm going to give DFC sort of a little bit more time to kind of reorganize under the Biden administration. And I hope one of the things that DFC will be able to look at is financing for environmental issues. I think that that's an area where a region where you see so many differences, that's a point in common, and something that's really critical. One of the things that we're looking at in Venezuela is the fact that Venezuela is currently flaring and venting about 2.4 billion cubic feet a day of gas. It's the largest in the hemisphere, probably the second or third largest in the world, and a very critical situation for the environment. I hope that the Biden administration will look at that, and DFC could potentially be a solution.
Yeah, well, just to interfere a little bit in that question, because I also thought about Harris. When you try to focus on root causes, obviously corruption is a major issue. Can you really reform corruption and the corruption that exists, particularly in the Northern Triangle, that creates an entire area of anarchy? Not to speak about Mexico. In Mexico, in this electoral campaign, I mean, about 90 candidates were killed, right? And so, maybe this question could be, directed to both of you, Dr. Ellis and President Solis. I mean, how can you fight these deep structural problems, this state in a total state of decomposition? And you mentioned it, I think it was Dr. Ellis or Luis Solis, I think, mentioned the importance of the rule of law. The rule of law is basically, the law means zero, means nothing in some of these countries. Are we talking about refoundation of the state? Can we eliminate, those bad apples and bring new good apples? that I find just very difficult to eliminate corruption, which is one of the problems of the misery that all these nations are living in.
The problem is that but the same thing happens with the other structural problems. It's not only corruption. How fast can you eliminate poverty? How long it's going to take for you to eliminate the lack of institutions that provide services that are essential, like education and health and water services.
That sounds easier than corruption.
Like corruption. I mean, it's a process. It takes time. Nations are built up through the ages, literally, and therefore to imagine that you can change all of that in 4 years or in 8 years or in 15 years, it's impossible to do it. So I think the approach has to be more pragmatic, more focused. I think that the administration knows. You have to look at certain territories that are expelling more people than others. You have to look at short-term and longer-term terms in order to solve it. For example, I think one big push has to do with destroying the human trafficking networks. That's a short-term thing that needs to be done because they are fueling the caravans. They are administrating this, and it's a horrendous humanitarian challenge. We have to do that in short term, but then you have to do other things that are going to take more time. So you're right. I mean, it's like refoundation. But as I've said it before, I don't think that it is the Biden administration nor the United States in general responsibility to solve the problems of the caravans. I mean, the United States, that's our problem. I mean, it's our elites, private and public elites in Central America that ought to be held responsible and accountable for what's going on. Because if there is poverty, it's not your problem here in the United States. That resulted from decisions or lack of decisions that should have been made by the Latin American elites. And I'm not saying only the political sphere, but also the private sector, which in many ways has also been responsible for some of the things that have happened or are happening in there.
If I could jump in, because I think this is a particularly important point, and I also want to relate it back to U.S. policy because I think it goes to the heart of what we're talking about tonight. And of course, President Solis knows this far more than I, because he actually, managed this as a real problem in a real country. But what I've perceived is, over the years as I've worked at so many of these, the solution to every problem is related to every other one. And so, if you have to address to some degree the corruption problem to be effective in bringing security. You have to address the security problem in being able to bring economic opportunity. And you never have resources to do it all at once. And so what you get is the problem of coordination. To what degree incrementally can you bring down corruption a little bit and create disincentives for corruption and solve a little bit of the security problem and create safe spaces in which you bring real opportunities. But if you bring transportation networks in, do you also bring, have incentives for the right businesses to come in? And so it's hard enough when you have perfect control over a country and, in Congress and getting the funds and things like that. And let alone things like all the things that throw you off, like, the community that doesn't want you to build the road, through the place that will actually, open up the opportunity to get the products out to market. But the problem then becomes when you superimpose the United States saying, okay, we're the United States, we're here to help. And oftentimes, we are famous for sprinkling little bits of money on other people's problems. And so, our, military teams are always very, very well intentioned, and our security assistance will train up a handful of people, or we'll do one limited exercise. USAID, God bless their souls, again, are typically resourced for a small number of projects. Fiscally, we turn programs off, we turn them on, we plus them up, we put restrictions on them to say, well, you can't deal with this organization or this person. And so at the end of the day, if you take this already almost impossible problem in the best circumstances of coordination that needs large amounts of funds, and you say, well, to what degree can the United States, with its uncoordinated bureaucracy and the constraints that we, through our domestic politics, put on how you can spend that money and who you can help, And so at the end of the day,
I think he froze.
can you hear me now?
Yes, just another minute, then we have to end it. Okay.
At the end of the day, and continue, at the end of the day, you were saying?
So, and again, I mean, I think Vice President Harris's that the agreements were in the right direction, but at the end of the day, if you say, okay, we're gonna bring a few things for at-risk women and populations and help educate, these are important things, but the problem then becomes, you get things that bring limited benefits for a limited amount of time, and that's good, but. And again, I think as President Solis knows far better than I, to really make a long-lasting difference, you need to make sure that those good things plug into a broader coordinated transformation of an economy. And if you don't, it just makes you feel good, but it doesn't address the long fundamental problems.
On that note, this is fabulous. I would like to bring this to a close. This was an amazingly terrific webinar. Thank you all, the panelists, for sharing your expertise and clearly educating us. We are so fortunate to be part of an organization that attracts such scholars and produces such scholarship. Of course, I'd like to thank Luis, who organized this event. Thank you, Luis. You're a terrific partner in this venture. I thank all in attendance this evening. Without your presence and participation, we would not exist. For those who came late, the Palm Beach Center for Democracy and Policy Research is a nonpartisan public policy organization, a research center and a think tank. And as demonstrated this evening, we are clearly a gathering of scholars, experts, and community stakeholders engaged in research and dialogue. We are also a 501c3 nonprofit. Please visit our website at palmbeachdemocracy.org and click on the donation button. Your tax-deductible donation will allow us to build an even stronger presence here in Florida, throughout the US, and throughout the world. And with that, I once again thank our panelists, Luis, and most of all, I thank all of you for attending, and good evening.
And thank you to the panelists. Thank you, Dr.
Thank
Ellis,
you. Good night.
President Solis.
Good night,
Thank
everyone.
you, Voght, and also to Joseph that had to leave earlier. Thank you, really.
Good night, all.